In the year 401 BCE, a Greek army of 10,000 mercenaries, marching home after a failed campaign deep in Persian territory, passed by the ruins of an enormous abandoned city on the banks of the Tigris. Massive walls, still standing in places, enclosed a vast empty space where nothing much seemed to be growing except silence and scrub grass. The soldier who wrote down what they saw, a young officer named Xenophon, called the place Mespila, and described it carefully, almost admiringly, as the kind of fortification no army could easily take. He had no real idea what he was looking at. Less than 200 years earlier, that pile of scorched brick and collapsed towers had been Nineveh, the largest city on the face of the earth in its day, the capital of an empire that had, for nearly 3 centuries, been the most feared power anyone in the ancient Near East had ever encountered, an empire that could march an army into Egypt, deport entire nations at will, and burn a rebellious city to the ground as a matter of routine administrative policy. And within about 20 years of its final collapse, it had become so completely erased from living memory that 10,000 armed men could walk directly through the wreckage of its greatest city without a single one of them recognizing its name. Tonight's story is about that empire, Assyria, and about how a state built almost entirely on the machinery of terror, iron weapons, and mass deportation, so effective that its own kings bragged about the atrocities in their palace inscriptions, still could not survive contact with its own exhaustion, its own family, and a coalition of enemies who had simply had enough. It's also about something stranger, and in its own quiet way, something almost hopeful, how the very fire that destroyed Assyria's capital in 612 BC ended up preserving, by pure accident, one of the greatest libraries the ancient world ever assembled, tens of thousands of clay tablets that nobody on earth would be able to read again for 2,500 years. Get comfortable, let the weight of the evening settle over you, and let's go back to the beginning, to the years when Assyria first started turning itself into a war machine. Assyria had existed as a modest trading kingdom in northern Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years before it became the empire we're talking about tonight, but the version of Assyria that would eventually terrify the entire ancient Near East really began to take its familiar, brutal shape under a king named Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from around 883 to 859 BCE and built a glittering new capital for himself at Kalhu, a city we now usually call by its modern name, Nimrud. His armies carried iron weapons at a moment when many of the peoples they fought still relied more heavily on bronze, and that technological edge, combined with a genuinely professional, well-drilled military tradition, gave Assyrian forces a real and lasting advantage on the battlefield. But the thing that made Ashurnasirpal's reign a turning point wasn't really the metallurgy. It was the decision, deliberate and administrative, to make terror itself into a tool of state policy. His own royal inscriptions, carved to be read aloud and copied and remembered, describe in exact, almost bureaucratic detail what happened to cities that resisted him, officials flayed alive and their skins displayed on city walls, prisoners impaled on stakes outside the gates of towns that had rebelled, pyramids and pillars built from the severed heads of the defeated, left standing as a permanent advertisement of what defiance cost. Modern readers sometimes assume this kind of language was pure boasting, exaggerated for effect, and some of it probably was, but the strategic logic behind publicizing it was completely genuine and, from the Assyrian point of view, completely rational. A city that had heard, in vivid and specific terms, exactly what happened to the last town that resisted was a city far more likely to open its gates without a fight, saving the Assyrian army the time, expense, and risk of an actual siege. Cruelty, in other words, wasn't only cruelty. It was cheaper than war. That approach was systematized and scaled up enormously under Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in 745 BCE and essentially rebuilt the Assyrian state from the ground up. He replaced the old system of loosely controlled vassal kings, who could and did rebel whenever it suited them, with a network of directly governed provinces answerable to Assyrian officials. He built the ancient world's first genuinely standing, professional army, not seasonal levies of farmers called up between harvests, but soldiers who trained and fought year-round, giving Assyria a permanent military advantage its neighbors simply couldn't match. And he made mass deportation official imperial policy on a scale nobody in the region had attempted before, uprooting entire conquered populations, men, women, children, sometimes whole towns at once, and resettling them hundreds of miles from home, while moving other deported peoples in to take their place. The goal wasn't random cruelty. It was to sever conquered populations from the land, the local elites, and the collective memory that made rebellion possible in the first place, mixing peoples and languages until any given province was too fragmented to organize resistance. Later generations under Tiglath-Pileser's successors would deport so thoroughly that the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, exiled from their homeland under this same policy, would eventually pass into legend as the lost tribes, lost not because anyone hid them, but because the Assyrian state's entire purpose in moving them was to make sure they never found their way back to who they had been. By the time this machine was running at full strength, Assyrian power stretched from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Mediterranean coast in the west, pressing down into the Levant and reaching toward the doorstep of Egypt itself, held together by a combination of genuine administrative sophistication, roads, messengers, tax registers, garrisons, and a reputation for violence so thoroughly cultivated that fear did almost as much governing as the army did. It's worth sitting with that for a moment before we move forward, because it's the foundation everything else in tonight's story is built on, an empire that had, quite deliberately, made itself into the most frightening power on earth, and that would spend the next 150 years discovering just how much that reputation could accomplish, and eventually, how little it could actually save. Sennacherib inherited this machine from his father, Sargon II, taking the throne in 705 BCE, and he ran it about as aggressively as anyone before him. In 701 BCE, facing a coordinated rebellion across the Levant that included the kingdom of Judah under its king Hezekiah, Sennacherib marched west with the full weight of the Assyrian army, and what happened next has become one of the most argued-over episodes in the entire ancient Near East, precisely because we have two very different accounts of it that don't quite agree. Sennacherib's own version survives on several nearly identical royal inscriptions, the most famous carved onto a clay artifact known as the Sennacherib prism, or sometimes the Taylor prism after the man who acquired it. In it, Sennacherib boasts of devastating 46 of Hezekiah's fortified cities, deporting over 200,000 people, and trapping Hezekiah himself inside Jerusalem, like a bird in a cage, a vivid, memorable phrase for a king cornered and helpless. And then the inscription describes an enormous tribute paid to Sennacherib, and moves on to other campaigns. What it conspicuously does not say, in a text that otherwise never misses a chance to claim total, crushing victory, is that Sennacherib actually captured Jerusalem itself. The biblical account, in the books of Kings and Isaiah, tells a very different story about why. It describes an angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp in a single night, forcing Sennacherib to break off the siege and retreat home in disgrace. Centuries later, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded yet a third version, an Egyptian priestly tradition about a night near Pelusium when field mice supposedly gnawed through the bowstrings and shield straps of an invading Assyrian army, leaving it unable to fight. Modern historians genuinely don't agree on what actually happened in that camp outside Jerusalem's walls. Some point to the possibility of a sudden outbreak of disease tearing through the Assyrian ranks. Armies camped together for long sieges were, and are, extraordinarily vulnerable to exactly that kind of catastrophe. Others suspect a more mundane explanation, that Hezekiah simply paid an enormous tribute to make Sennacherib leave, and that the Assyrian king's inscription, carefully worded to avoid claiming a conquest he never achieved, is quietly telling the truth by omission, dressing up a costly, unsatisfying withdrawal as a triumphant victory. What we're left with, honestly, is a genuine historical puzzle sitting right at the seam between two of the ancient world's most important textual traditions, and the detail scholars keep returning to, again and again, is that silence in Sennacherib's own boastful record, the one thing his scribes chose not to claim. Whatever actually happened outside Jerusalem, Sennacherib went home and, rather than dwelling on an unfinished siege, poured his ambition into something he could fully control, his capital. He moved the seat of Assyrian power to Nineveh and rebuilt it into a true super-capital, expanding the city walls to a circuit of roughly 12 kilometers, raising a palace so vast his own inscriptions called it the palace without rival, and constructing an extraordinary system of canals and aqueducts, including a stone aqueduct at Jerwan that carried fresh water across a river valley from mountain springs some 50 kilometers away, to feed the orchards, parks, and elaborately engineered gardens he planted around his new city. Some modern scholars, most notably the historian Stephanie Daly, have argued something genuinely striking here, that Sennacherib's terraced, irrigated gardens at Nineveh, and not anything at Babylon itself, may be the true historical seed of the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, since no archaeological trace of a garden has ever actually been found at Babylon, while Nineveh's engineering matches the ancient descriptions remarkably well. It's a genuinely compelling theory, though far from settled among historians, and it's a strange thought to sit with. One of history's most celebrated wonders may have simply had its address wrong for over 2,000 years. None of it protected Sennacherib from his own household. In 681 BCE, he was murdered. The Bible and the Babylonian Chronicle both agree on this much, apparently by two of his own sons, while he was worshipping in a temple. The empire he'd expanded and the capital he'd built nearly came apart in the succession chaos that followed, until a younger son named Esarhaddon, the one Sennacherib had actually designated as his heir, fought his way to the throne. It's a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with. A king who could order 46 cities devastated without apparent hesitation still couldn't secure his own life inside his own temple, from his own children. This is a good point to pause for a moment, if you'd like, and just let your shoulders drop before we keep going, and if tonight's story is keeping you company, this is also a good moment to hit subscribe, so the next forgotten chapter is already waiting for you without needing to search for it later. When you're ready, let's follow Assyria a little further, into the years when the empire reached higher than it ever had before. Esarhaddon ruled as a genuinely anxious man by most accounts, deeply reliant on omens and diviners, constantly worried about plots against him, which, given what had happened to his father, was probably not paranoia so much as reasonable caution. But anxious or not, he expanded the empire further than any king before him, launching an invasion of Egypt that failed on its first attempt in 674 BCE and then succeeded spectacularly in 671, when Assyrian forces sacked the great city of Memphis and drove the Cushite pharaoh south in retreat. For the first time, and as it turned out the only time, Assyrian authority stretched from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of western Iran to the coast of the Mediterranean, the largest the empire would ever be, an almost unimaginable span of territory to hold together with Iron Age roads, messengers, and garrisons. Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE while marching to put down a fresh Egyptian revolt, but before he died he'd already carefully arranged the succession, hoping to avoid exactly the kind of bloodshed that had brought him to power. His son Ashurbanipal would rule Assyria itself from Nineveh, while another son, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, would rule as subordinate king in Babylon, a division designed to satisfy both sons and both halves of the empire's cultural identity, Assyrian and Babylonian, at once. It seemed, for a while, like a genuinely thoughtful solution to a problem that had destroyed families before his. We'll come back to why it didn't hold. Ashurbanipal, who took the Assyrian throne in 669 BCE, was unlike almost any king who'd come before him, in one very specific way. He claimed, in his own inscriptions, to be personally literate in cuneiform, able to read the old, difficult, scholarly Sumerian and Akkadian texts himself, rather than relying entirely on scribes, which was almost unheard of for a king of this era and region. Whether or not every detail of that claim was strictly true, the underlying passion behind it clearly was, because Ashurbanipal used the full resources of the Assyrian state to do something no king before him had attempted on anything like this scale. He built a library. Scribes were dispatched across Babylonia, to the old temple archives of cities like Babylon, Borsippa, and Nippur, with instructions to copy, and in some cases quite bluntly to seize, texts of every kind and bring them back to Nineveh. The resulting collection, gathered at the royal palace on the mound now called Kuyunjik, eventually held what's often estimated at somewhere around 30,000 tablets and fragments, though that number, worth saying honestly, is really an estimate built from what survived to be excavated centuries later rather than a precise ancient inventory. And scholars still debate how much of it represents Ashurbanipal's own new collecting effort versus older royal archive material that had simply been accumulating at Nineveh for generations before him. Whatever its exact original scale, the range of what it held was staggering: omen texts and medical treatises, astronomical and astrological records stretching back generations, royal correspondence and administrative rosters, dictionaries and grammatical word lists compiled by Assyrian scholars trying to preserve a Sumerian language that was already, by this point, no longer spoken by anyone alive, and literature, including the fullest ancient copies we have of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish. It was, by any reasonable measure, the largest and most systematically organized library the ancient world had yet produced. This was Assyria at its absolute peak, the richest, largest, most culturally ambitious the empire would ever be, its palace walls carved with breathtaking relief scenes, including the famous lion hunt reliefs from later in Ashurbanipal's reign, its treasury swollen with tribute from Egypt to Elam, its capital home to the greatest collection of written knowledge anyone on earth had yet gathered in one place. It's worth remembering, as we move into what comes next, that empires very often look their strongest in exactly the years right before the cracks start to show. And the cracks, when they came from inside the family Esarhaddon had so carefully arranged. Decades of near-constant warfare, against Egypt, against Elam, against endless smaller rebellions across a territory that stretched further than any single administration could easily hold together, had left the Assyrian state genuinely stretched thin, its treasury and its manpower both under a kind of quiet, compounding strain that doesn't always show up clearly in triumphant palace inscriptions. And then, in 652 BCE, Ashurbanipal's own brother, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, the subordinate king of Babylon that Esarhaddon had installed specifically to keep the peace between the two halves of the empire, rose in open rebellion against him. It was, by every account, a genuinely brutal war, fought between brothers who had grown up in the same household, each drawing in allies from across the region, Shamash-Shum-Ukin pulling in support from Elam to the east, from Chaldean tribes in southern Babylonia, and from Arab tribal confederations, hoping to overwhelm his brother with a broad coalition rather than fight Assyria alone. For 4 years the two sides ground each other down, and the war's climax came with a long, grinding siege of Babylon itself, Ashurbanipal's own forces starving the city his brother ruled until it finally fell in 648 BCE. Tradition holds that Shamash-Shumukin died in the fall of his own palace, some accounts saying he set the building alight around himself rather than be captured by his brother's soldiers, though the sources here aren't fully consistent, and it's the kind of dramatic ending later chroniclers sometimes reached for whether or not it happened exactly that way. Ashurbanipal won. But a civil war that levels a city as important as Babylon, fought with an army that could have been used almost anywhere else, is not the kind of victory an empire walks away from unweakened, even when it wins. The years right after brought little relief. Ashurbanipal turned the same exhausted army against Elam, Shamash-Shumukin's old ally, eventually sacking the Elamite capital of Susa around 646 BCE in a campaign of real ferocity. But even a total victory like that one draws down a treasury and a manpower pool that had already been strained by years of civil war before it. By the time Ashurbanipal's reign wound to its end, sometime around 631 BCE, the empire he left behind was, in almost every practical sense, running on fumes, and it's genuinely telling, for a king this famous, this well documented in his own lifetime, that historians still aren't entirely certain of the exact date or circumstances of his death. The records simply thin out, right when we'd expect them to matter most. If you're deep into that pre-sleep haze now, good, let this next part wash over you the way a slow tide comes in, because the ending, when it arrives, moves fast. What followed Ashurbanipal's death was a rapid, confusing scramble among his own sons and officials, Ashur-etil-ilani, then a general or courtier named Sin-Shumalisher, then Sin-Sharishkan, none of them managing to establish the kind of unquestioned authority an empire this large and this dependent on fear needed to hold itself together. And into that opening stepped a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar, who seized control of Babylon in 626 BCE and, rather than accepting any negotiated peace with Nineveh, founded an entirely new Babylonian dynasty and set about systematically dismantling Assyrian control of the south. Nabopolassar didn't do it alone. He allied with Cyaxares, king of the Medes, a power rising to the east in the Iranian highlands, and together the two forces began methodically rolling back Assyrian territory, city by city. Ashur fell in 614 BCE, the empire's old religious capital, the city the entire nation had literally been named after, sacked by the very coalition Assyria's own policies had helped provoke into existence. Then, in 612 BCE, the combined Babylonian and Median army turned on Nineveh itself. The siege lasted roughly 3 months. Later Greek historians, writing centuries afterward, added dramatic and probably at least partly legendary details. The historian Diodorus describes rivers being deliberately diverted to breach the city's walls, an image that's stuck in popular memory ever since, even though it's difficult to verify against the archaeological record. What we can say with real confidence, because the destruction layer is unmistakable at Kuyunjik, is that Nineveh was sacked and burned with an intensity that left the city essentially unrebuilt and unreoccupied in any meaningful way for the rest of antiquity. King Sin-Sharishkan died in the city's fall, and tradition once again claims he burned in his own palace, an echo of his great-uncle's supposed end in Babylon 2 generations earlier, similar enough that it's worth wondering, honestly, how much of that detail is separately verified history and how much is a story shape later chroniclers simply liked repeating. What was left of the Assyrian government and army retreated west to Haran, and remarkably, found an unlikely new ally in Egypt, a kingdom that had spent generations under Assyrian domination but now apparently feared a rising Babylon more than it remembered resenting its old overlord. It didn't save them. Haran fell around 610 to 609 BCE, and the last organized Assyrian-Egyptian force was crushed decisively at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, by a Babylonian army under the command of the crown prince who would soon become one of history's most famous kings in his own right, Nebuchadnezzar II. And that was, functionally, the end. It's worth sitting with just how total and how fast this was. An empire that had dominated the Near East for roughly 3 centuries, that had marched armies into Egypt and deported entire nations and built the largest library the ancient world had yet seen, simply ceased to exist as an independent political entity within about 20 years, no restoration, no exiled dynasty waiting generations for a comeback, no successor state anywhere claiming the Assyrian crown in any meaningful sense ever again. The empire that had made itself the most feared power on earth vanished from the map so completely that, as we heard at the start of tonight's story, a Greek army marching past its greatest city less than 2 centuries later had no idea what they were looking at. For a very long time after that, Nineveh was just a hill, or rather 2 hills, the larger one that would eventually be called Kuyunjik, and a smaller mound nearby that local tradition, drawing on the biblical book of Jonah, came to know as Nebi Yunus, the tomb of the prophet Jonah, one of the only threads connecting the physical ground to the ancient city's name across more than 2,000 years of silence. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, some European scholars had grown genuinely skeptical that the biblical Nineveh, a city described in scripture as almost impossibly vast, had ever really existed at anything like that scale, treating it as legend dressed up as history, the kind of ancient exaggeration nobody expected an excavator spade to confirm. That skepticism started to collapse in the 1840s. Paul-Émile Botta, the French consul at Mosul, began digging into the Kuyunjik mound itself in 1842, initially without much luck, before shifting his attention in 1843 to a site a short distance away called Khorsabad, where he uncovered the palace of Dur-Sharrukin, the short-lived capital built by Sargon II, enormous relief carvings, inscriptions, and colossal statues of winged, human-headed bulls that had been buried under sand and silence for 2,500 years, coming back into daylight for the first time since Assyria's fall. Not long after, an ambitious young British traveller and diplomat named Austin Henry Layard picked up where Botta had started, beginning excavations at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, Ashurnasirpal II's old capital, in 1845, and uncovering results so spectacular they made him famous almost overnight, entire palace complexes, wall after wall of carved narrative relief, and eventually, when he turned his attention to Kuyunjik itself in the later 1840s and into the 1850s, Sennacherib's long-buried palace. Without rival and, later still, Ashurbanipal's own palace with its extraordinary lion hunt reliefs. Layard's account of his discoveries, published as a book called Nineveh and Its Remains, became a genuine sensation back home, turning ancient Assyria, a civilization that had been, for most educated Victorians, little more than a few sentences in scripture, into a subject of enormous popular fascination. Moving those discoveries home was its own extraordinary undertaking. The colossal winged bullman statues, the lamassu, weighed many tons apiece, and getting them out of the ground and across thousands of miles to London meant building special wooden sledges and rollers to drag them down to the riverbank, floating them on rafts down the Tigris, and then shipping them the rest of the way by sea, an operation that drew crowds of curious onlookers at every stage, and that ended, for several of the largest and best-preserved lamassu, with a spectacle of their own. Enormous ancient guardian statues being hauled through the streets of London and installed inside the British Museum, where visitors could finally stand in front of something Assyrian kings had once meant only their own subjects to see. The most consequential single discovery, though, came a little later, and came from a man whose contribution has sometimes been underrecognized next to Bada's and Layard's better-known names. Hormuzd Ras Sam, born in Mosul and Layard's own trusted local assistant before eventually leading digs of his own, was excavating at Kuyunjik in the early 1850s when his team broke into a set of buried rooms containing an almost unbelievable quantity of clay tablets and fragments, piled and scattered across the floor in their thousands, the physical remains of Ashurbanipal's library, undisturbed since the fire of 612 BCE. It's worth saying honestly that the exact circumstances of Rassam's dig are a little murkier in the historical record than either Bada's or Layard's, with some later accounts suggesting he may have dug quickly, and at least once at night, on ground that arguably belonged to a rival French excavation concession, in the competitive rush to be first to a promising site, a genuine minor controversy in the history of the discovery, worth naming honestly rather than smoothing over, even though it takes nothing away from the scale and importance of what his team actually found. What nobody could do yet, though, was read a single word of it. Cuneiform script had gone unreadable for roughly 2,000 years by the time these tablets came out of the ground, and cracking it took a separate, equally dramatic effort. A British Army officer and scholar named Henry Rawlinson spent years, through the 1830s and 1840s, copying a massive trilingual inscription carved by the Persian king Darius I high on a sheer cliff face at Behistun, in modern Iran. An undertaking that meant hanging from ropes and makeshift ladders hundreds of feet above the ground to painstakingly transcribe text that had been placed there specifically because it was almost impossible to reach. That inscription, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform side by side, became the ancient world's version of the Rosetta Stone, giving scholars a known text in an unknown script to work from. The decipherment that followed wasn't the work of any one person, and in 1857 the Royal Asiatic Society in London staged a genuinely elegant test of whether it could actually be trusted. For scholars working independently, Rawlinson, along with Edward Hincks, Jules Oppert, and William Fox Talbot, were each given a copy of a newly discovered cuneiform inscription and asked to translate it in isolation, without comparing notes. When their 4 translations were opened and compared side by side, they matched closely enough to prove, to a genuinely skeptical scientific audience, that cuneiform had truly been cracked, and that this wasn't scholarly guesswork dressed up as certainty. It was against that backdrop that a self-taught scholar named George Smith, who had started his working life as an engraver of banknotes and had no university training at all, found his way into a job at the British Museum sorting, cleaning, and physically reassembling the enormous, chaotic backlog of tablet fragments that Rassam's excavations had shipped home. In 1872, sifting through pieces of that collection, Smith identified a fragment containing a flood narrative strikingly, almost eerily similar to the biblical story of Noah, a hero warned by a god to build a boat, a flood that wipes out humanity, birds sent out to search for dry land. As the story is often told, Smith became so excited by what he'd found, and by what it meant for how the ancient world's oldest stories connected to each other, that he reportedly began pulling off his own clothes in a fit of sheer excitement right there in the museum room, the kind of detail that's been repeated so often it's worth flagging honestly as a colorful, well-documented anecdote rather than something we should treat as verified beyond doubt in every particular. What's not in doubt is the impact of the discovery itself. Smith's announcement to the Society of Biblical Archaeology that December caused a genuine public sensation, and the Daily Telegraph newspaper funded an expedition sending him back to Nineveh specifically to search for the missing pieces of the same tablet, where, remarkably, within days of arriving, he actually found more fragments that filled real gaps in the story. There's a strange, almost consoling irony sitting at the center of all of this, and it's worth pausing on before we bring tonight's story home. The fire that Babylonian and Median soldiers set to Nineveh's palaces in 612 BCE was meant purely as destruction, the deliberate, furious erasure of everything the Assyrian state represented. But unbaked clay tablets, left to the elements or buried in damp earth, tend to soften and dissolve back into the ground over centuries. The same fire that destroyed Ashurbanipal's palace also, by pure accident, baked his library's clay tablets hard, turning fragile unfired clay into something close to ceramic, durable enough to survive intact under a collapsed roof for 2,500 years until Hormuzd Rassam's workmen dug down into exactly the right room. The violence that ended Assyria is very possibly the same violence that preserved the only detailed record we have of how Assyrians actually thought, worshipped, healed the sick, and told stories about the world before there was a Bible to tell some of the same ones differently. It would be satisfying to end there, with the fire that saved what it burned, but honesty matters more than a tidy ending, and the truth is that what survives from Ashurbanipal's library is still deeply incomplete. What Rassam and later excavators recovered is mostly fragments rather than whole tablets, tens of thousands of broken pieces, many of them duplicates or partial copies of the same underlying texts, painstakingly matched and reassembled by generations of museum curators working, in some cases, more than a century after the original dig. Some material was almost certainly damaged, lost, or left undocumented during the excavation and shipping process itself, in an era before archaeology had developed the careful recording standards we'd expect today. And even now, across the world's museum collections, there are reportedly hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets in total, from Nineveh and elsewhere, that no modern scholar has ever fully read or translated, meaning that Ashurbanipal's library, in a very real sense, is still being discovered, one drawer, one fragment, one patient translator at a time, 170 years after Rassam first broke into the room where it had been waiting. We like our collapses to arrive with a single clean cause, and Assyria refuses to give us one, any more than the other empires we've spent time with on this channel have. It offers a state that made terror into policy and, in doing so, may have guaranteed that everyone it ever conquered would eventually unite against it. It offers a king murdered by his own sons in a temple, and another whose brother burned rather than surrender to him. It offers a library built by a genuinely curious, literate king, in a city his own family had helped stretch past its limits. And it offers a fire, meant only to erase, that ended up doing something closer to the opposite, sealing an empire's memory in baked clay for 25 centuries, waiting for people who didn't exist yet, speaking languages that didn't exist yet, to dig it back up. Before you drift off, I'd genuinely love to know, what surprised you most about tonight's story? The discrepancy over Jerusalem, the fire that preserved what it destroyed, something else entirely? Tell me in the comments whenever you get the chance. Somewhere under a hill outside modern Mosul, in drawers inside the British Museum, and quite possibly in fragments nobody has picked up and pieced together yet, Ashurbanipal's library is still, quietly, waiting to be finished. Sleep well.